For those of you who know me, I have a habit of going off on tangents. So, I'm going to attempt to read off script and just read off script. But there's a lot of information. So like Amy said, there'll be question and answers at the end and stuff. Yeah, just take the time.
Cracking. The title of my conference paper is Slavery and the Western Theft of Identity. Kind of subtitle could be almost like the rewriting of accurate history. So every Black History Month as a child, the idea that Africans have no history was reinforced solely by reteaching transatlantic slavery, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Obama. So the purpose of this conference paper is to address the miseducation of the present-day Negro through slavery's theft of our identity by the systematic removal of sources to educate ourselves. Through history, it can be seen that Europeans have frequently interfered with the affairs of other countries, forcibly removing their people, produce, and wealth, then returning them to an imperfect state declared as their own personal freedom and left to deal with the aftermath. This can be seen specifically in Africa, where slaves were returned to different lands and with peoples of different dialects and cultures, creating an inability for cohabitation and descending the area into regressive war and chaos, attributed today to the African savagery and laziness. Similar cases can be seen in India after the first workers were shipped in 1838 for light gardening to work the fields, being returned to their native land and left in famine and poverty. Hopefully this conference paper will provide a more accurate world history, such as answering why there are so many Black and Indian people in modern-day Britain due to their ancestral immigration from one area of the British Empire to another. For racism to exist, people must be functionally and institutionally miseducated in regards to the human story, most predominant of which is that of African history. Dr. Henrik Clark states this is done by the history of Africans being altered to justify transatlantic slavery. Robin Walker states that to remove the issue of remorse in the colonizing nation by viewing the oppressed people as less than human. Within slavery times, the predominant method to avoid revolutions was to allow the slaves no access to any form of information or education. By keeping them ignorant of their history, the Western slave masters kept them submissive. However, although slavery has been abolished, the same principles are applied to the miseducation of the modern-day Negro, omitting large portions of our history and contributions to the world as a whole in multiple fields such as medicine, astronomy, agriculture, etc. Paul Williams states that ethnic absolutism is not natural, but historically produced, and that it leads to violence and irrationality. Without this information, the modern-day Negro has an inaccurate view of their own group esteem, leading to an exaggerated view of their own self-esteem. Furthermore, this manipulation is a chief contributor to black-on-black crime and conflicts within the Negro community. Overall, slavery is merely the tip of the iceberg in regards to the historical and institutional theft of the Negro's identity. In 3100 BC, King Neymar Menes, possessing distinct Negro features, unified Upper and Lower Egypt to create one of the most successful civilizations on earth. However, due to the Western perpetuated ideology, it's believed that their success was due to their invasion by Western countries, believing black pharaohs came into power in the 25th dynasty. The media's depiction of ancient Egypt reinforces this, leading us to believe that lighter-skinned people were the ruling elite at the time. The film Exodus illustrates this, where a casting director consciously decided all slaves would be black, but the ruling elite would be played by Caucasians, e.g. Christian Bale. However, ancient Egypt was first invaded by the Persians 2,500 years after its founding. Therefore, the theory that lighter-skinned people founded and developed Egypt is implausible. Frequently, images which depict ancient Egyptians as looking more Caucasian in origin are used for museum displays. For example, images of Nefertiti are displayed as the common view of an Egyptian without reporting the fact that her father was light-skinned. Jean-Francisco Champollion, who was the founding Egyptologist and the decoder of the Rosetta Stone,
So the guy who basically discovered how to speak Egyptian,
stated that the first tribes that inhabited Egypt came from Abyssinia, which is the former name for Ethiopia. In the Copts of Egypt, which were the lighter-skinned people that we see today, we do not find any of the characteristic features of the ancient Egyptian population. The Copts are a result of crossbreeding. It is wrong to seek in them the principal features of the old race. Furthermore, the Egyptians themselves confirmed their ebony complexion in the Portrait of the Races, an image found in the tomb of Ramses II, clearly portraying the Egyptian depiction of self to look practically identical to that of other inhabitants of Africa, the only difference being that of clothing, while simultaneously distinguishing themselves from both Indo-Europeans and Semites. Many similar sources disprove the idea that Europeans were the cause of ancient Egypt's success, debunking the white is right ideology, as well as all historical success being attributed to Europeans. This is not to say that ancient Egyptians were exclusively black. Such a mega civilization attracted immigration and invasion throughout its history. However, to assume an African country was predominantly populated by people who do not look African is preposterous. Now, it has been established that it was clearly Negroes responsible for the advancement in ancient Egypt. Their accomplishments can now be seen in an accurate light. Gerald Massey spent 36 years of his life writing a companion to Darwin's theory of evolution, stating that mankind is not only evolved out of Africa physically, but culturally, spiritually, and philosophically. Martin Bernal states in Black Athenia that the Greeks, considered historically one of the wisest civilizations on earth, studied and learned from the Egyptians. Aristotle himself stated Egypt was the cradle of all mathematic arts. They had a value of pi of 3.16. This pi reading came from a papyrus read of a child's school textbook. Therefore, Egypt's mathematicians had a more accurate number. Also, Aristotle was known to have insulted the Egyptian priests for withholding information from him, admitting they had knowledge unknown to them. Isaac Newton attributed them with the discovery of the so-called Pythagorean theorem, the 365-day calendar. They understood the concepts of the month of the zodiac based on groupings of stars. They pioneered heliocentric theory and the concept of the atom. Also, in regards to the calendar, they had an understanding of the leap year, and they had a separate calendar which had 1,460 years, and that accounted for the leap year, and they had a big festival at the end of that. They knew over half of the planets in the solar system, calculated lunar eclipses, and produced copious amounts of prose and poetry. In regards to feminism, they had 5 female pharaohs. Women could inherit and bequeath property, and there was a position titled Chief of Female Physicians in ancient Egypt. Imhotep, the first polymath, designed both the oldest pyramids and medical books. Hippocrates is commonly considered the father of medicine, when Imhotep's books predate him by 2,000 years or so. Amusingly, this being merely a snippet of their accomplishments, ancient Egypt was not the only great civilization in Africa, and by no means the oldest. In northeastern Africa, modern Sudan is the heir to the oldest kingdom in Africa, dating back 3 centuries before the rise of ancient Egypt. This reinforces the theory that their civilization originated from Inner Africa, a precursor to the modes and many customs of Egypt. For example, there are 223 surviving pyramids in Sudan, dating back to 100 BC. In Ethiopia, there are 30-ton granite structures which were carved and erected without a crane, resembling multi-story buildings, 2,000 years old, and they are still standing. West Central Africa, where supposedly the dumbest Negroes came from, as that was where most of the slavery abductions occurred, was explored and researched by the Dutch physician and writer Alfred Dapper in 1668. His recordings, being both written and drawn, portray a multitude of early African achievements. The Great Wall of the Kingdom of Benin is the largest earthwork prior to the mechanical era, estimated at 10,000 miles long. The city of Longo in the Kingdom of Congo is clearly displayed as having urban, straight street planning, multi-story houses, and gated outer city walls. It was an early client state for the Portuguese for 200 years, trading ivory and pepper, and had an embassy in Rome. The city of Agadez in the Empire of Sogonhai, which is modern-day Niger, had a population of 70,000 in the 16th century, which in comparison, London had less than half of this population at the time. The Mali Empire, which spanned 1,500 miles across, was the richest state in the 14th century world and in African history, other than ancient Egypt. There are still 750,000 handwritten manuscripts from this empire. One example of this is stated in Michael Palin's BBC program Sahara, where it mentions one clearly depicting the phases of the moon. The issue with this document is that it predates Galileo and Copernicus by about 150 to 200 years. Mansa Musa ruled over Mali as the richest human to ever have lived and was well known for his philanthropy. He was estimated at being around about 400 billion in modern day money. So he gave out so much gold in Egypt on his pilgrimage to Mecca, it took a decade for the price of gold to stabilize. Furthermore, South and Eastern Africa were the homes of Great Zimbabwe, where, dated at 1335 AD, 100,000 granite bricks are held together without any cement. The Swahili Confederacy was a semi-global trading network dealing with India, China, the Middle East, and the Javanese Empire. They possessed homes resembling that of 1920 Art Deco houses, which interiors were described by Basil Davison as containing good internal sanitation. To recap, this conference paper shines light on Negroes' heavy involvement throughout history to honing the world we inherit today. This is not to say that the effect we had was isolated to our native continent. Shakespeare's Othello and sonnets 127 to 142 alone attest to Negro involvement in early European society. Saint Maurice, commander of the Thesbians, the Egyptian legion of the Roman army, in the 3rd century, is depicted in a German 16th century painting as being black. David Olusoga, states the first recorded African community in Britain guarded a Roman fort in Cumbria in the 3rd century AD. Even locally, the Nottingham Black Archive contains an African star, a campaign medal of the British Commonwealth awarded for services in World War II for both British and Commonwealth forces, clearly attesting to Negro's involvements in World War II. Ivan van Sertima, a half-black, half-Native American writer, suggests that Africans sailed to America far before Columbus. This claim is backed by 13 European witnesses who talk about seeing Africans when they went to America, including Columbus and his son. Columbus's own account describes indigenous people gifting spears that they had traded with black people from the southeast. They were taken back to Spain and examined and concluded to be the same spears being traded with the Guyanese people at the time. Also, African oral traditions in Mali states that King Abu Bakr II abdicated the throne with 200 ships to go to explore the great continent to the west, confirmed by 2 contemporary Arabic documents from Egypt. Furthermore, the Smithsonian Institute found 2 skeletons that they concluded to be African tropically adapted, found at Holbay St. Thomas, dated from 1250 AD. In 1992, Dr. Svetlana Baladonova, of the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Germany made a discovery causing a triple check of her findings. The very same woman who developed the hair drug test found traces of cocaine in the stomach of Ramses II. She tested Sudanese mummies and found the same thing. Due to the cocaine plant exclusively growing in the Andes, it prompts the question of how this substance found its way cross-continent into the stomach of an African leader. This theory is further reinforced by the Sphinx's similarity to thousands of statues with Kenro and distinct Negro features found in Mexico, as well as elsewhere in South America, dating back to as early as 800 BC. All conveniently missing their noses, which is the most prominent of the Negro features. If the faces themselves depicted that of a Chinese or a Viking man, there would be no debate as to the status or inspiration and their origins. Dr. Clarence Wynant, summates in a letter to the New York Times, Van Sertima's work is the summary of 6 to 7 years of meticulous research based upon archaeology, Egyptology, African history, oceanography, geology, astronomy, botany, rare Arabic and Chinese manuscripts, letters and journals of early American explorers, and observations of physical anthropology. As one who has been immersed in Mexican archaeology for some 40 years, I must confess I am convinced of the certainty of Van Sertima's conclusions. This final section on transatlantic enslaved Africans is the culmination of this paper. Worldwide, we celebrate and disseminate the ideas of freedom, liberty, and democracy. However, if this is the case, then the idea of an enslaved people overthrowing their oppressors and replacing the government with a democratic system should be the most celebrated of all. Sadly, the most prominent case is that abolitionists such as William Wilberforce are attributed the credit for abolition, where self-freed slaves are not. Only once in history has self-freedom been accomplished, and this was truly the first country to abolish slavery, 3 years before Britain in 1807. From 1789 to 1804 in Haiti, enslaved Africans defeated the 3 major European empires of the time in battle, and 30% of their revolutionary forces were women at the time. The revolution itself was finally brought to fruition by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who declared Haiti independent and then killed off the remaining French left on the island to the encouragement of the British and the US. The French, after slavery's abolition, insisted Haiti pay them reformation of 91 million gold francs for loss of property, the debt not paid until 1947, explaining the deprivation of the modern-day area. This, in turn, led to the French Louisiana being sold to America due to its ineffectiveness to the French Empire after their loss of Haiti, thus cementing its importance as a world event that is rarely taught. This raises the question, do we celebrate movements of freedom and democracy, or only when they perpetuate the idea of white superiority? Slavery's overall abolishment for British colonies was in 1834, 2.5 years after the largest Caribbean revolution in history, where 60,000 slaves under Sam Sharpe burnt down half the fields and hung 500 slavers in revenge. This disparity of focus on abolitionists whilst ignoring the thousands who shed their blood for freedom is an insult to history. In summation, the part the Negro has played in building our modern world has been historically omitted. Initially to support an economic system built upon the ideas of racism, yet more recently to maintain the oppression of the Negro in modern-day society. The copious amounts of information, sources, and counter-arguments presented in this paper clearly show the model to be not just false, but dangerous. Can we fully understand the human story if we lack major parts of it from a range of countries and cultures? Especially in such a multicultural society, our education should reflect the multitude of contributions from societies and ethnicities across the world. Without history, men are little more than dogs howling in the darkness, ignorant of in which direction to proceed. Although slavery has been abolished for over 200 years and commendation is due for the progress we have made, it is important to preserve and not forget an accurate world history, especially after Africans were kept in European zoos only over a century ago. Thank you very much. Gang, gang, gang.